But there was a really important moment between Nixon and Reagan that sort of put American wines on the map. Can you describe to us what happened?
The Judgment of Paris, I'm sure
Judgment
you're
of Paris.
talking about.
And you've got a great section in the book about that. You've got the actual Time magazine. There was the one Time magazine journalist who was there, who reported this. But it's a great story. Some of you may have seen the movie Bottle Shock.
Right.
I have not actually seen the movie Bottle Shock, which is sort of incredible. But the Judgment of Paris story itself is a great story, and it really is what put American wines on the map.
Well, and one thing I learned, by the way, I did see Bottle Shock, but I reached out to Stephen Spurrier. He was the guy who did the tasting.
Hosted the tasting, not the University of Florida football coach.
No.
Steve Spurrier.
This is a British
British
wine merchant living in Paris, and he'd gone to California, and he was impressed with the wines, and he'd brought some back. And he invited the heads, the most elite French experts on wine to a lunch. He had some of the owners of the top Romani Conti, the top Burgundy, and some of the first growths, and some of the top restaurants in Paris. And he was going to serve California wine. It was meant to be kind of a novelty. Come to this lunch and try California wine. At the last minute, he made two decisions that really made history. He decided to also serve French wine side by side, and he decided to make it blind. So those were the movie kind of suggests that was his plan all along. He said that was a kind of a date, like Spurrier Florida coach. It was a game time call,
which is in your book,
right?
Which is in the book. Yeah.
So he decided, and what happened, that major moment for American wine was all these experts tasted the wine blind. They ranked it, and the American wines won.
Right.
They beat the top first growth wines. Stag's Leap, Chateau Montelena, both kind of were vaulted up to high levels, and that was a transformative moment for American wine. But one thing with the president,
what can I just to pause you there? What happened after that moment? I mean, because it was always the case that the fanciest restaurants in New York wanted to be serving French wines, wanted to be serving Italian wines, but there was a change after the Judgment of Paris.
Yes,
they wanted American wines.
It became
it sort of was. The California wine growers were scrappy trying to get into the New York restaurants.
Yes,
and everything flipped.
It suddenly became the wine everyone wanted to try, even very kind of elite East Coast wine snobs who would never touch anything outside of Burgundy and Bordeaux. So I'll give this California a try. And it started appearing, as you say, on restaurant wine lists, started getting served in the White House. But its actual origins in the White House of serving it, apart from Abraham Lincoln and all, was after Prohibition ended. And, the Prohibition essentially wiped out the American wine industry. Right. And then you had World War II that ended most wine imports. So there wasn't a lot of wine in the United States. So when they began serving wine again, Eleanor Roosevelt declared it would be served domestic and in small amounts. And that didn't work too well either. The small amount part aside, the domestic, because it still wasn't that great. In fact, Harold Ickes, who was a member of the cabinet, wrote in his diary that he'd been to the White House, and the sparkling American wine that Mrs. Roosevelt is serving is undrinkable.
Wow.
So that was Roosevelt. Then you come in Truman, then Eisenhower. It was kind of served as a novelty. It'd be, well, here's a lunch that's not very important. Let's bring in an American wine and we'll have it. Then you get to Kennedy, of course, and as you mentioned, all the focus on French elegance and the best wines in the world, as you know, were served during the Kennedy administration. It wasn't.
It's a pretty impressive list that you've compiled. Yeah.
So if you could go back in time as a wine enthusiast, Kennedy would.
You would hang out with a Kennedy, right? Yes, for sure.
Then it kind of, so you moved to Johnson, and at the time Johnson became president, the California wine industry opened up their whole wine Washington representation, the Wine Council, and they would send California wines over to the White House just so the president, hopefully, he would serve it. And actually, a very kind of historic wine moment took place in the Johnson White House. After when President Kennedy was assassinated, there had already been an invitation to the Italian prime minister to come to the White House for a state visit. It was Johnson's first state visit. So he wanted to highlight prominent Italian Americans. He extends the invitation to Robert Mondavi, who's then just not well-known California guy making wine. And Mondavi's told, if you're going to the White House, you have to really step up your game. You have to wear a tux. You have to, your wife has to come in a full-length mink coat, and you have to arrive in a limo. So he gets the limo, rents the tux, he shows up at the White House, the photos are taken. His brother, who's his wine partner, they go back, and his brother, or his brother's wife actually, starts to think that Mondavi must be embezzling from the business, because how could he afford the tuxedo and the limo and the fur? So they literally get in a fight, a fist fight on the floor. They break up. He leaves and said, all right, I'm starting my own wine company. And then, of course, Robert Mondavi went on to become one of the great winemakers of the world.
Yeah.
All because of the White House visit. But to fully answer your question, then when on, Nixon alternated back and forth between California and French, and it really became Reagan who basically said, well, it wasn't just California, only American, primarily California, but only American wines.
Yeah, I mean, he was, and the pattern stays really through that. What when American presidents had guests from France or guests from Italy, were they inclined to serve French and Italian wines? Were they inclined to serve, I'm talking about the last half century, were they inclined to introduce the leaders of these winemaking countries to American wines? How did they think about that?
It basically evolved once the point American wines had arrived, and after the Judgment of Paris, the idea was to showcase American wines, because White House state dinners, we try to showcase everything great about America: great entertainment, great food, interesting people, and great wines. And so they didn't want to depart from serving American wines, but presidents were very thoughtful. And Reagan, I think, actually was the first one to do this, but it's the policy, or the practice now. He had Prime Minister Chirac of France coming to visit him. And Reagan and Chirac had known each other back from when he was governor of California. Chirac was a mayor of Paris. Right. They were both wine aficionados. They drank wine together. So he's coming as president of the United States to host Chirac. He thinks, what do I do? How do I showcase American wine but not insult my guest? So he serves Opus One. That was the joint venture between Mondavi of California and Philippe de Rothschild of France. And he invited both to the White House. They both came to the dinner. So he was able to showcase American wine with the tip of the hat to the French